Dragon Age: The Masked Empire by Patrick Weeks. 1. Empress Selene strode into the University of Orléans' great chantry courtyard, surrounded by her entourage of servants and guards, and flanked by Sir Michel, her champion. The entire faculty had been assembled to greet her, and the professors bowed at her approach. In the wan morning light, the marble walls glittered like fresh fallen snow. The stone tiles of the courtyard had been set with a mosaic of Andraste, proud and defiant in her mother-of-pearl armor, with carnelian flames behind her. Selene noted with approval that the mosaic had been restored since her last visit, where she had seen that time and careless boots had knocked some of the stones loose. The mosaic of Andraste stared with lapis lazuli eyes at the chantry that gave the courtyard its name. It was the tallest building in the university, displaying its dominance with a pair of shining bronze domes that the university students jokingly called the bosom of Andraste. Not that the university chancelier had mentioned that to Selene, of course. Over the great bronze doors, over a mural of Andraste and her disciples, a phrase from the Chant of Light had been set into the stone in gold. A learned child is a blessing upon his parents and unto the Maker. The university chancelier and his professors stood with their heads bowed beneath the phrase, as Selene and her entourage made their way across the mosaic of Andraste.
Your Imperial Majesty,
Chancelier Henri Maurac said, and at a gesture from Selene, he and the other professors rose from their bows.
We are honored by your visit.
In such troubled times, Maurac, I find myself taking comfort in the knowledge and wisdom you and your university provide the future of Orlais.
Selene smiled and gestured to her attendants, and two of them produced a jumble of intricately wrought silverite that, with a few twists and turns, could ingeniously be shaped into a small but surprisingly comfortable bench. Sir Michel stepped aside, his eyes taking in the walkways and windows set into the marble walls, alert for any threat to the Empress, but always projecting the air of confidence Selene required in those who served her personally. Maurac started. He had clearly expected to invite her into his office to discuss the reason for Selene's visit in his place of authority, and perhaps show off a new manuscript some promising student had uncovered. Beneath the comparatively simple mask he wore as a younger son of the Maurac family, his lips pursed in confusion and concern as he took a moment to reposition his approach to the conversation for an outdoor setting. Selene was quietly pleased to have him off balance so early. The Empress wore a creamy satin gown trimmed with ropey strands of pearls and woven with intricate patterns of gold, set with amethyst, to mark the colors of the Valmont family. Her position as Empress dictated that this was the lightest and most comfortable gown she could wear in public, except when she went riding, but it nevertheless weighed enough to crush her back and waist by the end of the day. She settled onto the small silverite bench, careful as always that no sign of relief or discomfort betrayed her. She was aided in hiding her expression by the half-mask that all Orlesian nobles wore in public. It was inlaid with moonstone, and lines of gold suggested cheekbones and a nose. Tiny purple sapphires ringed her eyes, and dyed peacock feathers swept back from her head to ring her with a crown of gold and violet. The sapphires and feathers could be replaced with other colors to match a particular gown or represent a special occasion. Below the mask, the Empress's face was powdered white, and her lips were lined with deep red.
If your Imperial Majesty wishes,
Chancelier Maurac began.
Professor Darcy would be pleased to give a reading from his dissertation on the inferiority of Cunare society. It is a bold attempt to expound upon Brother Denativi's earlier writings, and if I recall correctly, you found his earlier work quite promising.
That does indeed sound lovely,
Selene said, and waited until Maurac had half-turned to one of the professors on his right, before adding,
but I find discussion of the great horned rulers of Parvolin somewhat stark on a day already beset by the promise of winter's chill.
As he jerked back to attention, she added,
Perhaps one of your professors could entertain us with a study of mathematics. I have, in my own simple way, been struggling with Faranian's theorem, and I would be quite grateful if one of your learned scholars could explain the process by which it is proven.
For a moment the great courtyard was silent but for a few birds, which, fed by students or groundskeepers, had elected not to fly north for the winter. Chancelier Morak swallowed. Even as a younger son, he should have had better composure. Selene wondered idly whether his open expression had led his family to banish him from the dangers of the imperial court to the scholarly life, or if he had forgotten his courtly training since coming to the university. In either case, it spoke ill of him.
Your Radiance,
He said, finally.
you think too little of your own scholarly pursuits. Viranian's theorem is exceedingly complex. I confess in my own mathematical studies, the waves of my intellect have broken upon its rocky shores with little result. However, if you seek a mathematical demonstration, I have devised a treatise upon a specific ratio found in nature so often that it must reflect the maker's own hand. I would be honored to...
Tea?
Selene asked, and gestured to one of her attendants, who produced an elegant silver pot inscribed with runes that kept the water within hot, with no need for a fire. Another servant drew forth cups and saucers of Antivan porcelain so fine that the morning sun shone through them.
Surely one of the other professors has mastered Viranian's theorem. The University of Orlais can hardly be the most learned institution in Thedas if we cannot understand the work of a simple Tevinter scholar.
Chancelier Morak looked affronted at that. Perhaps the man had not totally lost his noble pride after all.
I assure you, Your Radiance, the University of Orlais is unparalleled in its pursuit of knowledge and culture, due in no small part to the fact that Tevinter scholars are but slaves to the mages who rule them. In granting us freedom from pressures, religious or political, you have empowered us to further Orlais' culture.
Yes, Morak still remembered enough courtly training to throw the occasional barb. Selene was pleased to see that the conversation might be interesting after all.
One of your students, then? When I went riding with Comtesse Helena last year, she told me that she was sponsoring a young man whose mathematical abilities were nothing short of prodigious.
She took the teacup her servant offered and took a small sip.
Now that I think upon it, he was studying Viranian theorem, and the discussion led me to peruse it myself. Lennon, I believe, was the young man's name?
Yes.
Said Morak, his gaze going flinty as he saw where Selene was headed.
I think I remember his application. And while of course our doors are open to any who, through noble blood or proper sponsorship, are able to ensure that they will continue our distinguished traditions.
Tell me, Morak.
Selene said, and paused to sip her tea.
You study mathematics. Are you familiar with the number 0?
It was excellent tea, a Ravani blend of cinnamon, ginger, and cloves, sweetened with honey just as Selene liked.
Yes, Your Radiance.
Morak said after a moment of silence when it became clear that the question was not rhetorical. He took the teacup Selene's servant offered him with scarcely concealed irritation.
Excellent. That is the number of students at your university who do not come from noble blood. I confess to some disappointment in that matter, Chancelier Morak, as I had hoped to see some improvement since our last talk.
Your Radiance.
Drink your tea, Morak. I have not asked you to let peasants scurry through your halls. I have asked you to admit commoners who obtain sponsorship from a noble who recognizes in them some intelligence that transcends blood and offers a chance for Orlais to become greater through their studies.
Morak's knuckles were white on the saucer he held.
The young man you spoke of, Your Imperial Majesty, was an elf.
Selene turned to her champion, Sir Michel de Chavine, who was regal in silverite armor, enameled with the imperial coat of arms. His own family's coat of arms was inset just above his heart, while his mask was a simpler reflection of Selene's own.
Sir Michel, I believe the Chevaliers are renowned for their keen eyes. Tell me, is there not an elf already present with us in the courtyard?
Sir Michel smiled slightly.
In the manner of speaking, Majesty.
He pointed at the chantry, specifically the mural over the great bronze doors.
If I am not mistaken, that mural is a faithful reproduction of Andraste and her disciples by the legendary Henri de Lidas. At the time Henri created the original, the elves were still considered allies, as they had not yet attacked and betrayed Orlais. 20 years later, when divine Renata called for an exalted march against the elves, she also ordered the destruction of all chantry art that included elves.
He smiled.
But Henri de Lidas pleaded with such grace and passion that she relented and allowed this single piece to survive, provided that Henri cropped the ears of the now heretical disciple Chartan.
Selene inclined her head gratefully.
Ah, yes. And it seems the university has copied the original piece quite faithfully. Can you point out Chartan, Morak? The ears have been altered, but the large eyes make it quite clear.
Marak looked at the mural, then back at Selene.
Of course, Your Radiance. Unlike the Chantry, the university prides itself on creating an accurate vision of history. That is indeed the elf, whom Andraste freed from servitude to the vile Tevinter Imperium.
How strange that the university is so eager to fight against precious religious to limit its field of studies, would in this matter be unwilling to bend even as far as divine Renata herself.
It is a puzzle, Your Majesty,
Sir Michel said, and looked over at Chancelier Morak. The Chancelier took a long sip from the teacup, then set it back in its saucer, the porcelain clinking as his cup rattled.
We would of course be honored to review Comtesse Helena's application again.
Orlais honors your commitment to our culture and scholarship.
Selene inclined her head and stood. One attendant took the small silverite bench and collapsed it behind her, and Selene handed her cup and saucer to another.
Now, after this talk of matters religious, I believe I would like to spend a moment appreciating the lessons this chantry can teach. See that I am not disturbed, Chancelier Morak.
Then she smiled, and as a peace offering added,
When I am done, I would indeed be interested in hearing more about this ratio you say shows the hand of the Maker.
The professors bowed and hurriedly stood aside as Selene approached the great bronze doors. Selene's own servants held back as well, save Sir Michel.
You might have informed me of the turn you expected the conversation to take, Majesty,
he murmured.
The heresy of Chartan is not precisely common knowledge.
Selene smiled without looking his way.
I had faith in you, my champion.
Shall I accompany you inside?
I believe I will be safe enough in the bosom of Andraste,
Selene said as Sir Michel pulled the door open. Michel looked inside, taking in the room and assessing any potential dangers, then turned to her and nodded, and she walked in alone. The air was cool inside, though without the chill of the autumn wind, it was more comfortable than it had been outside. The stained glass windows cast beams of crimson light across the wooden benches, whose oiled scent filled the chantry. At the far end of the hall, the eternal flame burned brightly in a great golden brazier, the only other light beyond the windows. The chantry was empty save for a red-haired woman in a lay sister's robes, who rose to her feet as Selene came forward.
Your Imperial Majesty?
She murmured, bowing deeply. Sparring with Chancelier Morak over the elves had been a gentle prelude to the real test of the morning. Selene gestured for the woman before her to rise.
I am glad the Divine was willing to meet.
The red-haired woman smiled. She was unmasked, as those who served the chantry most often were, and while she spoke with a native Orlesian accent, her features were Ferelden. The masks were part of the game, the ruthless and endless contest by which dynasties were founded and lost in Orlais, and the chantry's insistence that their people go unmasked was meant to suggest that they were beyond politics. It was a suggestion that few in Orlesian nobility took seriously.
The matter at hand is, as your messenger said, quite serious, and the Divine would like to see it resolved. I am her voice in this regard. You may call me Nightingale.
Beneath her mask, Selene raised an eyebrow. The Empress of Orlais was rarely asked to address someone by a pseudonym. Still, Justinia would only have sent someone she truly trusted. Without ceremony, Selene sat down on one of the benches, her creamy satin gown bunching awkwardly and amethysts jangling against the wood.
You are familiar, Nightingale, with the tension between the Templars and the Mages.
When Nightingale hesitated, Selene waved for the other woman to sit as well.
Of course, Your Radiance.
Nightingale sat, moving with a casual grace and coming to rest with her simple robes unwrinkled and unbunched. The subtle series of movements was the mark of a trained bard, and Selene filed the observation away for use as needed.
The Templars have become even more restless since what happened in Kirkwall,
Selene said, staring at the brilliant red light of the stained glass depiction of Andraste on the pyre. Years of training let her see the woman beside her clearly at the edge of her vision.
as have the mages for that matter. What does Dorothea intend to do?
She had used Divine Justinia's given name deliberately, and saw from the corner of her eyes Nightingale reacted. The woman's eyes narrowed a tiny fraction, while her posture remained unchanged. Anger, then, but no insulted propriety. Nightingale might call the Divine by her given name, might well have known her before she rose to the position. All this passed in a heartbeat as Nightingale said,
The Divine does not wish to assume that what transpired in Kirkwall was anything more than the actions of a single mad mage driven to tragic action by overzealous Templars. You know that in some Marches city-states, mages face more restrictions than they do in Orlais. I do.
Selene said.
And I also know that you have not answered my question. If Dorothea proposes to do nothing to unite the Templars and the mages, she is following in the footsteps of Grand Cleric Elthina, who waited and prayed while Kirkwall tore itself apart.
She turned and faced Nightingale directly. The other woman had reacted again at the use of the Divine's given name.
Justinia wishes to see this world made better, Your Radiance. We gain nothing by acting capriciously. Sometimes, events do not allow us the time we wish, especially when magic is at play.
Selene looked at Nightingale, who sat as a proper lady, relaxed and poised in her simple robes, and made a guess.
I understand that during the last Blight, the Circle Tower in Ferelden was nearly lost when one of their senior mages became an abomination. After killing the creatures, the hero of Ferelden was forced to decide on the spot whether to kill every remaining mage in the tower.
Her barb struck home as Nightingale blinked, then said with heat,
We are hardly in the thick of battle, Your Radiance. We are always in battle.
Selene said.
It is only that some of us do not always realize it. A bard named Marjolaine once told me that. I heard she met an unfortunate end in Ferelden.
She sighed.
Isn't that sad, Nightingale?
Nightingale paused for a moment, looking at Selene with cautious respect.
I suppose,
She finally said,
it is a matter of perspective. And perhaps you might call me Leliana. Perhaps I might.
Selene said, and smiled before lowering her voice and continuing.
Divine Justinia must know this. I have nobles begging in private salons for the throne to take direct action in this matter.
At Liliana's shocked look, she nodded.
There are men of Orlais who would sooner see us march upon our own people in the name of safety. I would despise that. Dorothea knows that I would. But I must offer them some alternative.
Liliana stood, frowning in thought.
You wish the Divine to make some overture of ameliorating the situation?
Selene let out a breath.
In truth, any overture will bring complaints that I have allowed the Chantry free rein to rule this empire for me.
She said, and Liliana nodded wordlessly.
But if Justinia can calm tempers before I am forced to turn the blade of the empire upon itself, then I will pay such a price willingly.
Liliana smiled.
You think less for yourself and more for Orlais than I had expected, Your Radiance. It is a fortunate quality in a ruler, and one I had not seen enough.
Selene stood as well, and for a moment her gown was bathed in the crimson light of the stained glass.
Tell me something. How large was the archdemon?
Liliana laughed the delicate, cultured laugh of a noblewoman or trained bard. The effect made her sister's robes look like a poor disguise.
Large enough, Your Radiance, that after having seen it, most problems seem small by comparison.
Her face turned serious, and she added,
I will ask Justinia to consider acting directly. She will want your support to head off accusations that she might be attempting to steal power for herself. Of course. Perhaps if she made a statement at a ball thrown in her honor?
Liliana considered it.
It is not the place where one would expect her to make such a pronouncement, which is why you like the idea.
Selene said, smiling.
It will also ensure that many of the nobles petitioning me for action will have little choice but to hear her words and know that the matter is being attended to.
Liliana grinned.
You are trained as a bard well, Your Radiance. It is easy to forget. I shall take the proposal to the Divine. 3 weeks.
Selene said.
Or at most a month. Any longer and I will have no choice but to act. The nobles will want some sign of resolution before they retire to their winter homes.
Liliana bowed.
Your Imperial Majesty?
The divine spy left through a hidden side door, and Selene sat back down on the bench. This time, mindful of her training, she sat without making a sound or wrinkling her gown in the slightest. 3 more weeks of gritting her teeth and dealing with Grand Duke Gaspard, who agitated with the other nobles in an attempt to start a war. 3 weeks of trying to ignore the idiotic arguments started by thuggish Templars and mages who refused to see the way of the world. And her reward for perseverance would be Gaspard bellowing that she had let the Chantry have more power, as though power was a sword only one person could hold at a time. It was not. Power was a dance to be navigated with partners, knowing when to lead, when to follow, and when simply stepping on the hem of a rival's gown could send her to the ground in shame. In careless hands, such power could bring down the greatest empire in Thedas. The culture and history of all of Orlais was Selene's to protect. It was at times like these that she enjoyed the simple pleasure of bending a recalcitrant professor to her will.
3 weeks,
Selene said, and allowed herself a moment to watch the fiery light play through the stained glass. The half-masks that the nobility wore in public were always mirrored by the masks of their servants, albeit less extravagantly and with less variation than the nobles, who could often afford different masks as the needs of fashion dictated. If a lord's house mask was a lion carved from ivory and inlaid with onyx and gold, his servants' masks would be lions as well, painted black and lined with brass. The masks protected the servants when they were about, warning tradesmen and merchants that any offense given to the servant was potentially an offense to the servant's master. To servants of other houses, the masks were a way to instantly recognize a potential ally, or a potential enemy. The masks worn in the royal palace at Val Royeaux by servants who were to be seen in public mirrored the one worn by Empress Selene. Where hers was inlaid with moonstone, theirs was simply enameled, or inlaid with ivory for the highest-ranking servants, and the gold and violet was simply painted on. Below the half-masks, the servants of Val Royeaux painted their faces white, a mark of additional status. To a visitor, looking at a sea of pale faces trimmed with gold and violet, the servants were almost identical. The women wore serving dresses, the men tight breeches, both cut in the latest fashion and dyed in the royal colors. Only the guards and the servants who were never meant to be seen, the cook and her assistants, for example, or the laborers who cleaned the privy, had their faces visible. But the goal for the half-masks that every servant wore was pageantry, not anonymity. Otherwise, the mask would have covered Briala's elven ears.
"You there, rabbit?"
called the chatelaine as Briala passed the great hall. Briala turned.
Mistress?
Turned you out, did they?
The chatelaine looked back to the great hall, where servants on ladders were adjusting a great purple banner so that the golden lion of Empress Selene's House Valmont would hang at the proper height.
It may be acceptable to have you dress Her Imperial Majesty on a normal day, but for a ball, they'll want everything proper.
She squinted.
Higher on the left.
Briala had seen the chatelaine prepare for countless balls before. The woman was always angry and snappish at the time, taking out her anxiety on anyone she could. Today felt different, however. Her barb had little heat behind it, and all the servants knew that Briala got on well with the girls who dressed Selene for the most formal occasions. She had to, lest they become rivals. What was more, a few stray locks of the chatelaine's hair had been caught under her mask, a faux pas that was completely unacceptable for any servant in the imperial palace. The chatelaine could not have failed to notice it, unless she had removed her mask and then put it back on quickly.
Yes, mistress.
Briala said. She had been Selene's handmaid since childhood, when the Empress had just been one girl among countless rivals for the throne. Now in Val Royeaux, Briala was one of the few elves who had been granted the mask of public service.
Well, you can make yourself useful then. Run to the kitchen and speak with the cook and her girls. The weather has been dry, and I won't have the meat go dry along with it.
She turned back to Briala.
Last autumn, Lady Monsimard said that a circle of magi served better duck than we did.
She glared, the narrowing of the eyes visible through the slits in her mask.
Tell the girls that if this happens this year, I'll have them whipped.
Yes, mistress.
Briella said again, ducking her head to make her respect clear. The hierarchy among the palace servants was strict and clear, while Briella's status as Selene's personal handmaid set her off to one side of the chain of command. She was by no means free of it completely.
Oh, no need to worry, Rabbit.
The chatelaine patted Briella familiarly on the shoulder. As she did, Briella saw that the clasp of the other woman's cuff was unfastened, another mistake that the servants who dressed the chatelaine would never have made.
It's just to put the fear of the Maker in the lazy things. We'd never whip you. Off with you now.
Yes, mistress.
Briella said for the third time, and left as the chatelaine began yelling at the servants to lower the left side of the banner. As she strode down the great hallway, the floors covered with fine Navaran carpet and the walls lined with classical paintings and curls of swirling stucco, Briella thought. The chatelaine had served Selene faithfully for more than a decade. She cared deeply about her job, and would never allow herself to be distracted on the day of a ball, unless she was somehow compromised. The clasp and the stray hair suggested a new lover who had pressed his or her suit and taken a few moments of the chatelaine's time. It could have been nothing more than that, of course, but in Val Royeaux, everything was part of the game, even the clandestine affairs of the more important servants. Briella had grown up watching the game, and as one of Selene's pieces, she was determined to win. If Briella assumed the worst, the chatelaine would not knowingly be involved in the matter. An embarrassment to Selene would bring embarrassment to the chatelaine as well, and if, maker forbid, Selene died or lost power, the chatelaine would doubtless be replaced. If this was something more than an overeager new lover, the chatelaine was a tool, not an active member of whatever plot was unfolding. The question was whose tool? The heat in the kitchens was stifling, as dishes from all across the known world were prepared. The cook, Rylene, was a heavy, ruddy-faced woman whose thick forearms were burn-scarred from an accident in her youth. If the result of the former chatelaine's thinking that Rylene was becoming presumptuous could be called an accident. Briella liked her, and she did what she could to protect the woman, who was better at making pastries than she was at the intricacies of the game.
Miss Bria.
Rylene called out, beaming, as Briella came in.
Does her radiance need something to last her until the evening banquet? With some lovely pastries from Lydas.
Thank you, Rylene, but no.
She looked at Rylene's girls, some human but many of them elven, and none of them masked. They were not to be seen by the nobles.
The chatelaine had concerns about the dark. She was very emphatic.
Rylene gave her a grateful nod.
I will see to it personally.
She dusted flour off her scarred hands and moved over to a pot, where a roasted dish was simmering in sauce.
And if you could send one of the girls to find out any last-minute schedule changes the chatelaine has made?
Briella asked.
Of course, Miss Bria.
Rylene smiled.
I'll have her find you. Thank you.
Briella left the kitchens and made her way around the palace. In the great hall, the chatelaine had finished with the banners and was now yelling her way through the organization of the tables. The elaborate card rooms bordering the hall had each been decorated in the style of a different country. From the great bearskin rugs and golden Mabari statuettes of Ferelden to the decadent silks and magical lamps of Tevinter. The balconies offered a view of the great hall, as well as an escape to fresh air outside, where verandas overlooked a hedge maze dotted with sparkling marble fountains.
You there, knife here.
Unlike rabbit, which was usually spoken with a friendly condescension that only made Briella grit her teeth a little, knife ear could never be mistaken for anything but an insult. It was what a human might use to address gutter trash that was too lazy to work and too stupid to steal. The captain of the palace guard did not wear a mask. None of the palace guards did. It would be too easy for an assassin to blend in and get close to the Empress while armed and armored. His face displayed the long angles that spoke of noble blood, and beneath his surcoat, emblazoned with the golden lion of House Valmont, his ceremonial breastplate gleamed. More important to Briala, one of the buckles on his breastplate was askew, and he had the welt from a love bite just below one ear.
Trying to sneak around and dodge your duties, knife here?
He said with a sneer.
The Empress bade me examine the preparations for tonight's banquet.
Briala did not bow. As the captain of the guard, he was important enough that she should, but Briala had enough power to skirt the rules when she truly wanted to, and at the moment, she truly did.
A pretty story.
He sniffed and then examined her with new interest.
Though, if you're keen to find some distraction, you've a fair enough form that I might ignore those flaps of filth jutting out from your head.
He stepped closer, blocking her view of the garden.
Perhaps I might even hold them, like reins.
He smelled of sweat, as well as lavender, the chatelaine's favorite scent. She stepped back inside.
I doubt the Empress would approve.
She turned and left without a backward look, still thinking. The captain of the guard was carrying on with the chatelaine, and his attentions had clearly been meant to harass her until she left, to distract her from looking down at the hedge maze below, which was why he had moved to block her view. From what Briala remembered, the captain had been brought in recently after his predecessor had died. Before that, the man had served in the military. Briala didn't know where, but given Grand Duke Gaspard's popularity with the soldiers, she knew who and where. All that was left was to find out what. She hurried down a curving staircase whose marble steps were carpeted with red velvet, but a call from behind stopped her before she reached the doorway leading out to the hedge maze.
Miss Bria?
Briala turned to see one of the elves who worked in the kitchen hurrying her way.
I was told to find you. Thank you, Desiree.
Briala smiled at the young woman.
What have you found?
Desiree lowered her voice and tugged at her sleeve nervously with thin fingers.
The chatelaine added a bard, Melisandre, to tonight's guest list.
Briala nodded.
Thank you. Now, if Raylene can spare you for another moment, may I ask you to find out what the captain of the guards has been doing today? Of course, Miss Bria. Raylene said that I was at your disposal. Good.
Briala turned to the hedge maze.
I will be in there. Hunting.
Selene had seen the Orlesian Chevaliers train. One of their most famous tests, at least among those tests they showed to the public, was a series of blades mounted on posts in a great wooden scaffolding. When servants worked at a massive hidden wheel, the blades would spin and slash, attacking anyone who passed with dizzying speed. Brave youths at summer festivals would try to rush through in heavy padded tunics, the blades blunted so that most contestants broke no more than their pride. In real tests, it was said, the blades were sharpened, and the soldier ran the gauntlet unarmored. That gauntlet was always how Selene imagined the formal banquets. Fortunately, she did not run this gauntlet alone. Her champion Sir Michel was a pace behind her, as always, unarmored so as not to cause a disturbance as Selene navigated the crowd, but carrying his blade nevertheless. His hose were rich golden silk, and his doublet was violet suede made from beasts the dwarves raised like cattle. His scabbard was ornamented with an inlaid line of gold with purple sapphires for the eyes and mane, and while his hands were bare of the rings and bracelets other nobles favored, he would allow nothing to impede his ability to handle a blade. He wore atop his mask the tall yellow feather of the Chevaliers.
Orders, Majesty.
He asked in a voice low enough to carry only to her. Michel usually spoke little at these events, which Selene appreciated. As her champion, he was an extension of her public presence, drawing attention not to himself but to her. He cared little for the game, but he had good eyes and followed orders. He had been with her for almost 10 years, since her last champion had died stopping an assassin.
Briala passed along what she found?
The sword in the bushes, yes, Majesty.
He kept his voice low and calm, and by his body language, they might have been discussing the lovely wyvern ice sculptures at the refreshment tables.
Watch the bard, Melisandre. It will begin with her.
Hopefully I will not be expected to pass any tests of religious iconography this evening.
Selene checked a smile.
I will attempt to warn you this time, should the need arise.
As Gaspard's bard, Melisendra, sang in a lovely voice about the end of summer and lost loves, Selene moved through a field of allies and enemies, well-wishers and would-be rivals.
Your Radiance!
Comte Chantrel of Velun bowed at her eye contact, the motion making the string of black pearls attached to his nacre mask rattle.
Your light will keep the birds from departing this autumn, for they will think the summer lingers.
Chantrel had been pressing for her hand in marriage for some time now. Given his apparent loyalty and clumsiness in the game, Selene kept him at a comfortable and friendly distance without ever completely dashing his hopes. Selene's ivory gown was cut low, and against her pale skin, a yellow diamond glittered in a rich golden setting. The gown complemented the great jewel, as teardrops of amber flowed from her bosom in ribbons of yellow that darkened to gold at the hem and wrists. Her mask was identical to the one she'd worn that morning, save that the feathers had been switched to gold filigree.
Your kindness is as soothing as the warm waters of Lake Celestine,
She said.
And though I fear the birds must depart or die in the winter chill, I know they will grace the skies of Velun come springtime.
She moved on and caught the eye of Lady Montsimard, whose mask was set with glowing lyrium crystals on each cheek, a gift from the first enchanter in the Orlesian Circle.
Cosine,
She said with friendly familiarity as the other woman gave a deep curtsy.
it has been too long. Tell me, how did you enjoy the dark?
The sauce was divine, Your Radiance.
Lady Montsimard and her husband had entertained Grand Duke Gaspard during the summer, and in past years had held out the family's proximity to, and control of, the Circle as a bargaining chip. Selene found the husband dangerous and the wife dull, and suspected that Lady Montsimard did not realize how precarious the situation with the mages had become. Her guess proved true as Lady Montsimard added,
Though, in truth, when we visited the Circle of Magi,
Oh, I should have a care when dining with them.
Selene cut in with a light laugh.
It seems that when they try to prepare a meal, everything around them ends up burned.
She moved on as Lady Montsimard stammered out her farewell with a strained smile. Behind her, Selene knew without looking that Sir Michel had fixed Lady Montsimard with a disapproving stare, a wordless reminder that Selene could laugh and play the game, or, if she chose, she could have Lady Montsimard's head mounted on a pike. She made a note to speak to Madame de Fer, the mage of the imperial court, about Montsimard's familiarity with the mages. On and on she went through the crowd, trading greetings and kind words laced with poison. Should Orlais push for more advantageous trading terms with Ferelden while the upstart kingdom was still recovering from the blight? What was to be done to ensure that nothing like Kirkwall could happen here? Was the university where noble sons came to study truly going to start admitting knife ears? Selene's jaw ached from smiling. It was the clearest expression visible below the half-mask and under the layers of makeup that covered her face. Beneath the bladed words, Melisendre's beautiful voice continued. Then, finally, the pageantry ended with the laughter of Grand Duke Gaspard. It was a deep, booming bellow that had echoed across battlefields. It silenced the timid and the servants like a death knell, and pulled the other lords and ladies into chuckles with its weight. The crowd before Selene parted, showing a clear path to the Grand Duke and the dark-haired bard before him. Melisendre was unmasked, though she wore the heavy makeup commoners donned at noble gatherings, and she had turned away in embarrassment at whatever Gaspard had said. Selene steeled herself without any outward change of expression. She had played the game for most of her life. No matter how prepared she was, no matter how much she had considered and planned and determined her strategy, there was always one moment of fear. Then the moment was over, and she was moving toward the bard, who had been surreptitiously added to the guest list at the command of a guard captain loyal to Gaspard. Sir Michel's steady footsteps moved in time with hers, the large man matching her pace perfectly. Melisendre was good, Selene noted, but not perfect. The makeup covered the fact that she could not affect the blush that would signal actual embarrassment, but she would have been smarter to add red makeup at the cheeks to give the assembled nobles the impression anyway. Seeing that little imperfection, not even a mistake as such, but a detail that Selene could have done better, somehow made everything seem easier.
And with what wit has my cousin silenced so sweet a voice?
Selene asked into the expectant silence. Melisandre paused, uncomfortable, but Gaspard dipped his head, a bow just barely sufficient to avoid undeniable insult.
Your Imperial Majesty,
He said, still chuckling.
I was pointing out that the young lady's song had a melody similar to King Megrin's Mabari.
The assembled nobles tittered, scandalously amused. Selene kept her smile in place. It was a good first strike. The song had been popular and harmless decades ago, during the Orlesian occupation of Ferelden. It told the story of the unhappy Megrin, sent against his will to Ferelden by Emperor Florian. In the song, the hapless noble was comically frustrated at every turn by rough Ferelden culture, including a slobbering Mabari hound that ate his mask. Well, never forbidden, the song had lost its popularity after King Marek of Ferelden killed Megrin. Since coming to power, Selene had done her best to strengthen ties between the two countries, and the song mocking the crude Fereldans and their uncultured customs had never come back into fashion. Until now, it seemed.
I remember singing this with the men during marches,
Gaspard said.
It took us back to the days when Orlais stood poised to conquer the world. Poor Megrin, trapped far from the baker's gaze, trying to make himself at home among the dog lords.
He was a tall man, broad in shoulder, and his doublet and hose were cut with hard lines and silver trim to give the impression of armor. His mask was gold, set with emeralds to match his family's heraldry, and a tall yellow feather sprouted from the mask. Like Sir Michel, he was a member of the Chevaliers. He was also standing not 10 paces from Ban Tegan Guerin, the Ferelden ambassador. The man's face, bare of makeup, clearly showed his anger at hearing his people called dog lords.
It was a sad time for all of us.
Selene said, turning to the ambassador with a smile.
And Orlais is pleased to count Ferelden as a friend in these trying times.
Tegan smiled gratefully and bowed.
Your Imperial Majesty, Ferelden hopes the same.
Of course.
Gaspard strode forward.
What's past is past, Tegan. And now we're just two old warriors.
He clapped the Ferelden on the shoulder, and Ban Tegan stiffened at the familiarity.
Did you bring your dog with you to Orlais, my lord?
Melisandre added, the dark-haired beauty the very picture of innocence, even as the crowd chuckled. Tegan turned to her, fists clenched at his sides.
Yes, though not to this ball. I doubt he'd appreciate the food.
That got a laugh from the crowd. While not a master of the game, the Ferelden noble was smart enough to see when he was being set up and to try to get the crowd on his side.
Someday I'll have to see your dog, Tegan,
Gaspard said, not to be distracted from his play.
But tonight, in celebration of the friendship between our empire and your kingdom, I brought something for you.
He snapped his fingers, and a servant rushed up carrying a long bundle wrapped in rich green velvet. Gaspard took the package and handed it to Tegan with a wide smile. Reluctantly, knowing he was stepping into a trap but unable to find a way to avoid doing so, the ambassador unwrapped the package. Inside, as Briella had informed Selene earlier in the afternoon, was a sword. It was Ferelden in make, largely functional but with a few hints of ornamentation around the hilt and crossguard to suggest that it was the fighting blade of a noble. It was worse for wear, with nicks along the blade and a few spots of rust.
Grand Duke Gaspard.
Michel moved to put himself between Selene and the sword. The weapon should never have made it into the hall. Guards at the palace entrance checked all packages to prevent an assassin from bringing a weapon inside, which was, Selene reflected, why Gaspard had gone to so much trouble to get the package smuggled in and hidden in the hedge maze earlier that day.
At ease, Chevalier.
Gaspard eyed the blade.
I'd as soon come with someone with a fireplace poker as I would wield that thing.
He nodded to Ban Tegan.
It was taken off the body of some Ferelden noblewoman who got caught making trouble for poor Megrin. Myra, I believe.
Behind his gold and green mask, his eyes twinkled with good humor.
Our servants had been using it to kill rats in the cellars.
Tegan had gone still, looking at the sword in his hands as though the rest of the court had vanished. The green velvet bunched around his white-knuckled fists.
That was a noble sword?
Melisandre asked, adding just the right touch of doubt to lure the crowd into laughing at the battered blade, and drive Tegan further towards saying something that Gaspard could construe as an insult. It was a simple play, but an effective one. Van Tegan would be goaded until he said something in anger. Then Melisandre would gasp in shock to ensure that even the dimmest nobles understood that they should take offense. Selene would then get to choose between having Sir Michel challenge Van Tegan to satisfy Orlay's honor, and saying nothing, allowing Gaspard to brandish his Chevalier's code of honor and deliver the challenge himself. Either result would sour relations between Orlais and Ferelden, moving them closer to another foolish war. War was where Gaspard shone brightest. All this crossed Selene's mind, even as Gaspard twisted the knife.
Well, she called herself the Rebel Queen. Closer to being a bandit or a mercenary captain, really. She thought she could drive us out of Ferelden.
And she was right.
Tegan said, still not looking at Gaspard.
Her son Marek drove you all out of our kingdom.
Shame Moira didn't live to see it.
Gaspard said, looking around the room with a grin.
Perhaps if she'd had one of your big dogs.
A few nobles laughed. It was just enough to drive Tegan over the edge. Selene saw his shoulders tense, saw him open his mouth to say exactly what Gaspard had been waiting for.
Van Tegan?
She called out. She had ruled the greatest empire in the world for 20 years, and she knew how to send her voice slicing through a crowd to drive it to silence. Mouth still half open, the Ferelden noble turned to her. Because she and Gaspard had played the game for long enough to be old familiar enemies, she gave her cousin a tiny smile before stepping forward. Excellent try, the smile said, and next time, perhaps you will be clever enough to succeed. But not tonight.
Your Imperial Majesty?
Van Tegan stood ready, the veins in his neck taut.
I see from your expression that this blade has awakened old feelings in you. Has Orlais given you offense in the death of Moira Theron, Rebel Queen of Ferelden?
As the crowd took a collective breath, she added,
Do you demand satisfaction?
Tegan looked down at the blade in his hands, and then over at Gaspard, and finally, because he might have been lackluster at the game, but he was not a fool, he looked at Selene herself, judged her stance, and quietly said,
I do.
As the crowd erupted into yells, Selene smiled. Gaspard closed his eyes and shook his head, already knowing that he had lost, while his bard Melisandre looked to him in confusion, clearly uncertain how she was supposed to pull the crowd now. Selene looked over at Michel and gave a tiny nod, and her champion drew his blade. The yelling of the crowd of nobles went silent at the sight of bared silverite, shining blue in the grand ballroom.
Then satisfaction you shall have.
Selene said to the Ferelden ambassador.
Sir Michel?
Your Radiance?
Michel asked, blade drawn, never taking his eyes off Van Tegan.
We have been challenged and you are my champion. Do you stand ready to defend the honor of Orlais in a duel between men of noble birth?
Without pause, Sir Michel said,
I do not, Your Radiance. Since we are the challenged party, it falls to us to choose the weapons used in this duel. We may not proceed until we do so.
Ah.
Selene paused for a moment, letting it build.
I see. I would be loath to stain the still-mending friendship between our two nations with noble blood shed in defense of past slights.
She turned to Van Tegan.
Thus, as is my right, for the weapons in this duel, I choose feathers.
Very good, Your Radiance,
Sir Michel said, and without hesitation, he plucked the tall yellow feather from his mask. The nobles in the crowd were fickle, bloodthirsty, and vain, but above all they were hers. As much as they would have enjoyed the scandal of a bloody duel, they admired a good display of wit. As Sir Michel brought his feather up with the crisp precision of a master swordsman, the nobles burst into delighted laughter. Van Tegan visibly relaxed, dropping the velvet-wrapped bundle to his side and giving Selene a relieved smile.
Your Radiance, I regret that I am unarmed for a duel of this nature. You may note that my nation prefers fur to feathers.
When he raised his fur-trimmed sleeves, he even got a laugh from the crowd.
Quite so.
Selene looked over at Gaspard, who had assumed the polite smile one used in court to deny one's enemies the satisfaction of a snarl.
Cousin, you have shown your generosity to our cousins in Ferelden with your first gift tonight.
She raised a hand and gestured in gratitude.
Would you be so kind as to offer a second?
Gaspard blinked, then bowed.
Nothing could please me more.
he said, and with a quick, controlled gesture, he plucked his own feather from his mask. Then he handed the yellow feather, the honored symbol of the legendary Orlesian Chevaliers, to the Ferelden Dog Lord he had just insulted. As Sir Michel and Ban Tegan thrust and parried with their feathers to the delighted laughter of the crowd, Selene smiled and called for Melisandre to sing something celebratory. Brialla came to Empress Selene's bedchamber that night through a secret door hidden behind a full-length mirror on one wall. The Empress had bathed after the ball, she often did, and changed into a satin nightgown of rich violet. The candle at her writing desk was barely enough to illuminate the pages she had been reading, and most of the room was lit only by the light coming in from the window, the pale yellow of the autumn moon above, and the warmer orange of Valroyo itself below.
Has he spoken yet?
Selene asked, not turning around from where she sat at her writing desk. Brialla smiled at her Empress, whose long blonde hair was still touched with damp, catching the moonlight as it streamed down her back.
Yes, though I did not think it worth interrupting your evening. Your former captain of the guards has already confessed to smuggling in Gaspard's gift and has thrown himself upon your mercy.
What an optimistic decision on his part.
Selene chuckled, put down her pen, and turned to Brialla. Selene's face was, as it had been since childhood, a finer version of her mask. Fine bones, porcelain skin, and red lips that naturally curved sweetly.
And the chatelaine?
Brialla hesitated, and Selene offered her a curious smile. Finally, Brialla said,
Foolish and infatuated, but not disloyal.
Thinking of Desirel and Eileen, who might have been whipped had the dock had not been satisfactory, she added,
Though some gentle chastisement might ensure that she accepts her newfound disappointment with grace and dignity.
Selene stood, still smiling.
Of course,
She said as she came forward.
Given our victory tonight over Grand Duke Gaspard, generosity is only appropriate.
Selene's fingers traced softly on the side of Brialla's neck, and with a tiny rasp, Brialla's mask slid free.
After all, Bria,
She said softly as she set the mask aside.
one must make allowances for mistakes brought on by infatuation.
Brialla smelled roses and honeysuckle as her naked cheek grazed Selene's, the gentle sense of an empress's bath. And the satin of the nightgown was cool between Brialla's fingers as it slid away to bare pale skin.
whatever you feel best, your radiance.
She whispered, and with her free hand, snuffed out the candle.